Something I find just as interesting as consoles themselves are the controllers. They come in many different shapes and sizes, and things like button layouts can be wildly different. Controllers are the things that directly accept our inputs, so I think it would be cool to take a closer look at them, specifically ones from Nintendo. For simplicity's sake, we're only going to take a look at controllers that came bundled with home consoles. So we won't be taking a look at third-party controllers or other options that the manufacturer provided. We'll go through all the different controllers first, and at the end, we'll make a decision on which controller is best according to some different criteria. There's 4 decades worth of controllers to look at, so let's get started. If you were to ask a non-gamer what a controller looks like, this is probably what they would come up with. The NES Controller, D-pad, A and B, and start and select. That's it, and for the most part, that's all you really needed for games of the era. It might look a bit unergonomic, but since it's so light, the edges never really press into your hand, and it feels really comfortable to hold. A little detail to note is that the buttons are concave. I think it looks really cool, and it's also sturdy because it's so simple. Definitely one of the most iconic controllers ever, along with the Atari 2600 joystick. In JDM land, the Famicom controller was similar, but with a different design that has a very Game & Watch-like metal plate, some rounded edges, but it does look pretty cool still. Those controllers were hardwired into the console, and the second gamepad even featured a microphone. Shows you how forward-thinking Nintendo was even back then. The NES and Famicom were facelifted several years later, and the controllers changed to a more rounded shape. If you've ever heard the term dog bone controller, this is what they're referring to. I'd imagine they would be harder to use with Super Mario because you have to hold the B button a lot while simultaneously pressing the A button to jump, and these buttons are tilted the wrong way. The Super Nintendo controller expanded on the NES controller's basic layout by adding 2 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons. It looks very much like the dog bone controller. It's light, comfortable, and still pretty durable because it's still a simple controller. This is quite a step up in my opinion. It's got plenty of buttons now, which makes it possible to play more complex games like, for example, Street Fighter 2 and Link to the Past. There were 3 different variations of the controller. This one is the North American version, which can easily be identified with its purple buttons. X and Y are concave, while the other 2 aren't. Not sure why, but I guess it makes it easier to know what button you're on by feel. The Super Famicom has this controller instead. I think it looks better with the colors, but the wire is dramatically shorter. There are no concave buttons either, which really doesn't matter to me. PAL NES controllers look like the Super Famicom gamepads, but with SNES branding and the long cable found on the North American counterparts. Also, a quick tip, you can simply switch out the short cables with long ones if you want. The procedure is very simple and easy to do. All you need is just a regular screwdriver. This controller is one of the most important designs ever because this is what Sony based their PlayStation controllers on, which eventually became what everyone considers to be the standard controller layout. That's quite a big deal. Next up is the Nintendo 64 Controller. This is a pretty crazy looking beast, and in terms of its looks, I think it's actually pretty awesome. It's kind of like a spaceship almost. Obviously, the big deal here is the analog stick and the triple grip design. The Super Nintendo button layout is still there though. The D-pads on the left, 4 buttons on the right, and L and R bumpers. The select button kinda disappeared, but we have some new additions like the Z button underneath, which is kinda like a trigger for a gun or something, and 2 additional face buttons. There's like 3 different ways to hold it, apparently, but for most games, this is how one would go about it. I think it's really comfortable. It conforms well to my hand whichever way I hold it, and the buttons all feel pretty decent. The plastic has a tough feel to it with a slightly textured surface. The biggest weak point of the controller is, I'm afraid, the analog stick. They wear out tremendously fast and then start wobbling around. That often translates into involuntary movements while playing. It's not just age though. I remember how they felt brand new and I still didn't like them back then. It's not smooth, but more like a grindy feeling, and it gets worse the more you use it. The PlayStation dual analog and DualShock controllers are much nicer in that regard. The slot on the bottom is the expansion pack where accessories like rumble packs and memory cards plugged into. For modern standards, the N64 controller comes across as bizarre, but I think that's what makes it really interesting, even if I'm not a fan of the analog stick. For the GameCube, Nintendo decided to go with a more conventional looking controller. The analog stick is much improved in my opinion. It doesn't suffer from the same grainy feel, and the grippy top ensures that it won't slip off like the N64 stick did for me. The L and R bumpers have been changed to analog triggers. So far, this is the only Nintendo controller that features that. There's a lot of travel before it bottoms out, with a final click at the end. The C-stick is really well done. It's easy to move because it's so grippy. You don't even need to be precise with the thumb at all. The face buttons are arranged in an interesting fashion. It provides a bit of hierarchy you don't see on current controllers. It kind of makes sense. The most used button is A, B is important too, just not used as much, and X and Y are mostly reserved for secondary functions. Rumble is now built in as well. The only thing I don't like is how imprecise the D-pad is. Most games don't rely on it that much, but it's not so great if you're playing 2D games with a Game Boy player, for example. The GameCube controller is the most comfortable controller I've ever held. There's something about the shape that makes it fit my hand perfectly. I can't be the only one because this is the only controller that I know of that can be used by 4 different generations of hardware. Some Wii games had the option of using GameCube controllers, most notably Super Smash Bros. During the Wii U era, Nintendo even reintroduced it along with an adapter. And now with the Switch, these controllers can be used in conjunction with the adapter originally meant for the Wii U. Nintendo wouldn't have gone through the effort of making the GameCube controller work with all of these consoles if people didn't love it. In a way, you can say that the GameCube controller both preceded and outlived the Wii Remote. Speaking of which, here's the Wii Remote along with its not always essential accessory, the nunchuck. They initially called the Wii the Revolution, and it makes sense because it certainly changed how companies approached controller design. For the first time, motion controls were a standard feature for a mainstream console, and despite some wonkiness, it mostly works. Also called the Wiimote, it's wireless, runs 2 AA batteries, which is nice for collectors, and is intended to be used in a multitude of configurations. You can hold it like this, or even sideways, where the button layout becomes reminiscent of an NES controller. It can be paired with the nunchuck to give you an analog stick and 2 extra buttons. The nunchuck also senses motion, by the way. The button layout isn't that hard to learn, but it's definitely non-standard. Some games had an interesting idea of what function should be mapped to what button. Later on, the Wii Motion Plus add-on improved motion sensing capabilities by adding a gyroscope, and later controllers ended up having that function built into them. What I like the most about this setup right here is that you can have your hands farther apart than you would with a regular controller. For games without or minimal motion controls, it's nice being able to just relax my arms and have them lay on either side of me. It looks super lazy, but I don't care. Interestingly enough, it has a speaker and even memory, which was primarily intended for the transfer of Miis, though some games did use the memory for a few other things. The Wii encouraged game developers and gamers to think differently, and while we did end up with some truly horrific shovelware, we also got some truly great games that wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the Wii and its innovative controller. These days, many controllers have some sort of motion control capabilities built in, even if it isn't as prevalent as on the Wii. Next up is the Wii U, and it's another dramatic change. In a way, the Wii U gamepad is more like a traditional controller, if you can ignore the screen, that is. 2 analog sticks, 4 face buttons, start and select, L and R, and ZL and ZR. The layout is very standard. Obviously, it's got the touchscreen, which is resistive and, in my opinion, a bit old school. The console handles all the processing, and the image is streamed over to the tablet. You can see the compression artifacts, but it's actually not that bad. The image and sound on the tablet is slightly delayed compared to the HDMI output, which is to be expected. It still has motion sensing capabilities, but any sort of pointing and flicking is still the task of the Wii Remote. There's a forward-facing camera, which I've never used. The battery is rechargeable, but it doesn't last very long at all. It has NFC capabilities in order to connect with amiibos, and you can control your TV because of its built-in IR. So it's filled to the brim with different features. But as much as I love the Wii U, I avoid using the tablet whenever possible. It's comfortable to hold and the buttons feel nice, but it's the weight that makes it a bit tiresome after a while, so I just use the Pro Controller whenever I can. The buttons feel the same and there's none of the weight. Not to mention the battery life is amazing on that thing. I think it's like 40 hours. I do like that it's possible to use the Wii U without a TV. There were some occasions I made use of the feature. It's clear though that many people didn't like this controller, including a lot of the people who liked the console itself. But it provided the basic idea of Nintendo's next console. We are now in the present. This is the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo really likes to experiment with new things, don't they? The Joy-Con, as you probably already know, are these two controllers right here. It can be used on the console in handheld mode, on a grip, and like this, with each bit in one hand. It's got all the buttons any modern controller has, including a screenshot and record video button. It still does the motion control stuff if you wave them around, and like the Wiimote, turning them sideways makes them into little controllers you can use for local multiplayer. It has little buttons on the top here, which means in terms of layout, they're kind of similar to an SNES controller. The right Joy-Con has some more doodads than the left one, an IR sensor, and NFC for amiibos. They've got really decent battery life at a claimed 20 hours. The analog sticks feel pretty good. I like how tactile the buttons are, but I've got a few gripes with them. I think it's a bit too easy to accidentally hit the L or R buttons, while the face buttons feel too stiff in my opinion. Others have complained about the fact that the analog sticks and buttons are directly on top of each other, and the fact that the D-pad isn't really a D-pad. That I don't have that much problem with personally. I think the Joy-Con are very good, especially if you take into consideration all the things they need to do. Their versatility is one reason the Switch is so successful in my opinion. And that covers the controllers. I think one conclusion we can get from this is that Nintendo isn't afraid to change up their controllers. Other companies do experiment with interesting control methods as well, but Nintendo takes more risks by making their unique controllers standard rather than an optional extra. There's no objective way to figure out which controller is best, but I'll give you a couple of opinions. If we're talking about historical significance, I think I'll have to give that to the SNES controller, because it became the foundation of the modern controller. When the whole Nintendo-Sony partnership fell through, Sony took the basic layout of the Super Nintendo controller and added some extra buttons and eventually 2 analog sticks. I would give the title of most innovative controller to the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. It was very ambitious and influenced other companies to start looking at motion controls more seriously. Out of all of these controllers, my personal favorite is the GameCube Controller. It's so comfortable, and it looks fun and quirky with its differently colored and shaped buttons. Plus, how can you not respect the fact that it works with 4 different generations of Nintendo hardware, including the Switch? The GameCube wasn't that popular to begin with, yet the controller managed to survive somehow. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. I've been wanting to talk about Nintendo controllers for a while now, so hopefully you found it interesting. I'd love to hear what your favorite controllers are, so leave a comment if you want to share your opinion. If you want, you can also find me on Twitter, Twitch, and Discord. And also, there's a Patreon if you want to help me make better videos and get a couple of extra perks, like an exclusive newsfeed and early access videos. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again next time. The Joy-Con, as you probably already know, are these two controllers right here.